And welcome back to another episode of the Outside 50 podcast presented by US Footy News. As always, I'm your host, Rick Shaibani, and alongside me are my co-hosts, Ben Martinez and Tara Cilke. How you guys doing?
Great, thanks, Rick. Good morning.
Doing well, Rick.
Yeah, we're doing it a little earlier than usual today, but it's all good. We're all looking happy and healthy and hanging in there these days. And today, our guest is a little bit of a follow up to the Danny Marshall podcast, which was just released. James Waddell has been involved with Denver Bulldogs for many years. He's helped get American players like Danny to play over in Oz. And he's also done some great work with the consulate here in the US and also just developing the game of footy in general. How you doing, James?
I'm good, Rick. How are you? Hi, Ben. Hi, Tara.
Hi, James.
Thanks for joining us today.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
we're glad to have you aboard. And this one was Tara's idea, obviously. Kind of wanted to do a little follow-up from Danny's appearance. But yeah, James, just tell us a little bit about your background, what brought you to the States, and what you're doing to help grow the game.
Yeah. Thanks, guys. So, I've been in the United States now. I was just talking to someone yesterday for 16 years. And what initially brought me to the United States was baseball. I was, in fact, a quasi-professional baseball player in my younger years, whilst also trying to be an AFL footballer. I was the Australian poor man's version of Bo Jackson. So I managed to get over here, through both. So I squeaked out a little bit of a WAFL career when I was younger. Or grew up loving football. Can remember every player from every East Perth team in the, and give my age away here, 70s and 80s, and just could not give up football, even though I had a reasonably successful baseball career that did eventually lead me to the United States. Football was in my blood from day one, and it still is very much part of my life today. So, and when I first landed in the United States, I didn't have a job, and before I even looked for a job, I looked for a footy club. So that's that tells you about my love of footy.
Yeah, I'm sure you're excited to have another Perth guy on the podcast, right, Ben?
Certainly am. I've got some East Perth, blood in my family. So although more of a Swans boy, but I certainly respect the Royals. So yeah, no, that's a great story though. It's a great story, but yeah, very good to have a fellow Perthonite, West Australian on the call.
Yeah, we've got a few sand gropers at the Denver Bulldogs, Ben. So next time you're up here, we'll have a waffle discussion.
Definitely.
There you go. And so have you always been involved with Denver, or what brought you to them specifically?
So yes, I have. So when I finished playing baseball, so I played in the Australian Baseball League for a while with the Perth Heat and the Melbourne Monarchs. At various stages, I continued to play my footy on the side. As I said, I played 9 games of waffle, all losing games. Ben, you'll be happy to know I played 5 for West Perth and 4 for East Perth, and every one of them my team lost. So I had a very inglorious waffle career. But as I started to get better at baseball, I was on the national team in '92 for the Olympics and all those kind of things. Baseball just took over, and even when I moved to Melbourne to play for the Melbourne Monarchs in the Australian Baseball League, I convinced them that I should still play footy. And I had a run in the VFL with Williamstown, and Barry Round was the coach, the largest hands in the history of the world. And I grew up in Perth barracking for Carlton before the Eagles. That's my AFL team, Ben. Hopefully you are, and you're not a docker. But if you
we've got the same AFL teams, James. That's great. Carlton and West Coast, brilliant.
So good, mate. We're mates already.
Waiting for the whole
growing
day.
Up, I was Alex Jezelenko is my hero in football, like my hero, and I still to this day wear 25 on every jumper or jersey I can because of Jezelenko. And when I was in Melbourne, I went down and I was playing footy for Williamstown, but I wanted to play for Preston because Jezza was coaching. And a good friend of mine, Cameron Richardson, who was the Danny Marshall connection, said, "Mate, don't do that. You'll be disappointed. He's not that great a coach. Just leave him as the hero in your mind that you already have him." So I didn't go and do that. By that stage, I was really really fully into baseball. So I just went and played local footy in Melbourne for Killer Park, and so. But again, I just couldn't stop playing the footy. But baseball brought me here. As I finished playing with my Australian Baseball League career, I coached the national under-16 team and had some of the best young players in the country under my watchful eye, and that led me to get a scouting job with the New York Mets as an international scout. And so I was coming over a little bit in that role with the Mets. I went to spring training in 1998. I can tell you a great story how the reason that Mike Piazza ended up at the Mets is because of me. That's another podcast. But in the end, I met a lovely American woman as I was traveling here, and then she lived in Australia. We got married, and now we're back here. The deal was we were going to do 5 years in Australia and 5 in the US. Well, she did 4 in Melbourne with me, and I'm on 16 here. So you see how that worked out, right?
Yeah. Yep, definitely. That's no, that's an intriguing backstory. Like I'm sure plenty of Americans wouldn't think that there's baseball at all in Australia, in the same way that lots of Aussies wouldn't know about footy in America. So it's kind of ironic and funny that you have an equal background in both sports. And yes, so when it came to growing the game here in the U.S., specifically in Denver, what were the main things you started out with? I know you've done some work with youth clinics and like Auskit programs, things like that. What's been the biggest success there in terms of getting people involved?
Yeah. So when I got here, it was 04. In 04, I just missed the USAFL Nationals by about 2 weeks, and so the first
Oh,
night that I'd met the Bulldogs, they were on their pub crawl after winning one of their early championships, and I was like, "Wow, these guys are pretty confident guys," And so I had a year to kind of get myself organized. But one of the things I had done before I left Australia, in an attempt to find employment for myself, was to contact every AFL club and ask them if they needed an AFL scout in the USA. So I was completely role reversing my role as a baseball scout in Australia and flipping it over to becoming a footy scout here. I was a little bit ahead of my time back then because there really was no scope in the draft for any of the AFL clubs to look at USA talent. I think there'd been some various attempts back in the 80s. Essendon had a guy, and it just was, there's a whole story about, the desires or the fears of Australian footy clubs to really let Americans in, which makes Mason Cox's story so much more interesting, right? But at the time, the one club that contacted me back was Collingwood Football Club, and Derek Hine, who was the recruiting guy there, I still think is a recruiting guy. He contacted me, and I got 10 grand from Collingwood to run a tryout over here back in 2005 to try to find the American guy. We had a guy called Mike Lavalley who we discovered through that tryout, who was a local Denver guy who played very good football for Denver Bulldogs. So Bulldogs were the beneficiary of my tryout here. But we had the US national team come in. As I said, we're a little bit ahead of our time, and the AFL clubs just didn't have the scope, and they didn't want to take a risk. But it was a really interesting process, and Tom Ellis who's the Revs coach, has always been a good friend of mine. Tom and I have always had this dream of trying to get Americans to play in the AFL, and that was sort of probably the starting point, I think, for Tom's interest in pursuing it. Ultimately, we did not get Mike Lavalley there. He was just a little bit old at the time, and but it did plant the seed, I think, and I was really happy to see Collingwood, even though I hate Collingwood Footy Club as an AFL fan. I was really proud of him and really happy for Mason Cox's success with Collingwood Footy Club. So that was sort of the first thing that I tried to do with AFL clubs anyway. There's some other stuff I've had a crack at, but that was the first thing.
Yeah, and that's a really impressive CV in and of itself. And I think you're right about the risk aversion. A lot of AFL clubs don't really want to do that. Obviously, now you have, I think, you can get between either 1 or 3 Category B rookies. Like guys who are Aussie but are converting from basketball or cricket or something, or Gaelic guys or American guys. And I think I remember a few years ago seeing Coxie getting quoted because like the AFL stopped doing the U.S. Combine and are like shifting focus back to Ireland. And that's all well and good. Like, it's kind of a catch-22, in my opinion, because, like, a lot of people assume that Americans are going to be, like project players. And obviously, most of them are because, they just don't have the exposure to the game at a young age that the Aussies do. But also with the Irish guys, and plenty of them are phenomenal players, very fast, very gifted, great kicks. But, the reality is a lot of them get homesick, and some of them go home before they ever even make it onto the senior list at the AFL. So obviously, per capita, Ireland produces a ton of talent, and there are more Gaelic players on AFL lists than there ever have been. But I personally, I don't think it has to be either or. There's so much talent in the U.S. and there's so much talent in Ireland. Like, there's no reason why those resources can't be allocated to both places. So I think, the AFL they are a little short-sighted when it comes to consistently scouting American talent and actually taking it as seriously as they might other sports in other countries, like with Gaelic.
Yes, I got a whole theory about it. I could go on for a while, and I think you touched on it to some extent, and I think the deeper, without getting too deeper in psychoanalytics on the Australian psyche, is that I think they love that Americans love their sport, our sport, right? They love it. It gives them a big ego boost. But I think they get a little nervous that the Americans will take over their sport, like America takes over everything in the world from its cultural exploitation or exploration, if you want. So there's a little bit of that kind of, and Ben, you'll just back me up on this. The tall poppy syndrome's alive and well in Australia, and I think Mason Cox is viewed as quite a novelty and an interesting experiment. The Australians love that they can offer the Irish some contracts. They can kind of control the Irish a little bit, and the Irish are maybe a little bit more grateful for the opportunities. Americans don't always come across as grateful for opportunities. There's a few different things going on there, and it'd be interesting to hear what Danny had to say about how she was received when she was there.
Yeah, actually, just to touch upon that, like, what was your involvement with helping Danny? And I know you also helped Sarah Roner try to get there. And so, what is your involvement, I guess, with trying to help U.S. players get over into Australia? Because I know you've touched upon that and helped several of our players try to get over there.
Yeah, I mean, it just sort of stems from that's just been my interest and been doing it back and forward. I actually help baseball players go and play baseball in Australia at the moment as well, too. So I just like that sort of diplomacy to and from exchange as much as I can, but also feeling that anytime we can get some Americans to stick at any level of footy over there, it's got to help the USAFL, because I know that we are, still, correct me if I'm wrong, still receiving some funding from the USAFL, never as much as they should give us, the cheap buggers, but I think it can just certainly help raise the profile and the significance of the game here, because it is and as I say, I saw it grow. My father was one of the first baseball coaches in Australia. He coached the first state under 13 team in WA for WA to go to a national championships. Player Trevor Chappell pitched against my dad's team. But I've seen how it can grow from the other way, and I just want to see it grow here. So when the women's program, I thought, was a really great opportunity, because I felt like the gap between the women that were playing here, the good, talented women that were playing here, and the women that were playing the AFLW wasn't as large as the gap is between the AFL men's and even our best USAFL men's. So that was an interesting another approach that I thought we could take.
What are some of the key factors you think in being successful in making it work over in Australia? So transitioning from American players to Australian.
Well, I tell this to all the baseball guys that go there. I go, two things. If somebody offers you a beer, buy them a beer back, and don't leave the country owing anybody any money. So firstly, culturally, don't be a jerk. Secondly, you need to have some humility and some humor about you. Of course, you need to have the ability to be able to play, but I think you will, if you are an athlete, and let's be honest, Rick, you were very kind to the Irish earlier, but mate, we have the best athletes in the world here. I sound a bit like bloody Trump there, but we certainly have the best athletes in the world in this country here. I mean, you think about
Mm.
from the women's perspective. I mean, we know what kind of male athletes this country can produce, but think about the women. I mean, number one women's soccer nation in the world, number one women's basketball nation in the world. They're like a top 5 rugby nation in the world. You probably rattle off. They win all the gold medals at track. I mean, really, this country can produce. So from an athletic standpoint, I don't think that there's ever been any doubt that a good American athlete is going to be as athletic as anybody. It's the cultural nuances and understanding the team aspect and the camaraderie and the humility. And I think that's what draws a lot of the Americans to the game here. So they've got to have that kind of roundedness.
Yeah, definitely. And what you were saying about the culture, I can attest to that. If it's your shout, it's your shout. Yep. But in all seriousness, yeah, that's a very good point you made. Like, I think the main difference in America, and I've talked about this on previous podcasts, is like there's no adult sporting culture here. So people who are fitness enthusiasts, like Ben, like we need an outlet. We need an outlet for something that we can kind of sink our teeth into. And obviously in Australia, like there's no collegiate system like the NCAA over here. There's cricket ovals and rugby fields and footy grounds everywhere you look. And, like obviously in America, if you're good in high school, you play in uni. If you're good in uni, you make it to the NFL or the NBA or Major League Baseball. But if you're not, you're done. There's no safety net. There's no VFL. There's no lower level. Like in Australia, obviously retiring at 22 is ridiculous. There's so much other stuff you can do at the local level or the state league level. So obviously in the US, that's been, in my opinion, one of the biggest obstacles to growing the game organically, is because the American mentality is like, sports are mostly for the younger people. And if you're 25, 30 years of age, there's nothing really for you there. So I think that's a huge factor. People are definitely looking for something with, that's fast paced, that's hard hitting, where there's real camaraderie and you can have a few beers with your mates once you're done. So
yeah. I have a 10-year-old kid who's into soccer and baseball and basketball and loves Aussie rules. Ben, you should see his room. It's got West Coast Eagles stuff everywhere. I walk into my son's room and I think Nick Nack is in there every day. But I'm watching him, watching how sport is kind of put in front of him and the opportunities that he has for sports here. And it's very different. It's a different upbringing. Like when I played footy, I played cricket as a kid, and I played basketball and I played baseball as a kid. But every kid thinks they're going to play in the AFL, or every kid thinks they're going to play in the MLB or whatever. But the reality is that you play footy to get to wherever you can, say in Australia. And I do feel like there's a lot of pressure on kids here that if you're playing sport almost for a purpose. Like you're playing at the elementary age kids are looking to try to get somewhere so they can get to a high school, and then you play sport in high school so that you can get into college, and you play sport in college so you can get into pros. And if you don't, okay, well, I'm done with sport now. I'll get on with my real life. It's a bit sad, I feel like for Australians, the sporting club is very much a part of their culture. I go home to my baseball club in Perth, and my friends are my mates' dads and now my mates' kids, and you're like, I have this kind of generational community around me from 6-year-olds to 86-year-olds that are all part of this club, and it's women and it's men and it's kids. It's the sport is part of it, but you can play C grade, F grade, D grade until you're 55 and hobbling around. You're still playing sport for the same reasons you were when you were 16 and more athletic.
That's very true.
Great point there, James. One of the things I was, and I share the same thoughts as what you've been saying, and that is, I'd always say, you look at the athletes that don't make it professionally. You look at those college athletes and even the high school athletes that don't make it to college or make it into those pro leagues. They're still phenomenal athletes. So it's a case of, where do those players go? What outlet do they possibly have? And they're still, just because they're not in that 1%, and yet they would, they're still just gifted, talented athletes. So One of the things I wanted to ask you was, you were talking about your baseball background there. I remember going to Perth Heat games in the early 90s. I remember getting introduced to baseball by a good friend of mine, actually, that played at a pretty high level. And I remember he was trying to get me from cricket over to baseball. And I mean, it was a great time for baseball in the early 90s. Everyone in Perth used to go and watch the Heat. You had, Greg Jeltz hitting him out of the ground, and you just had I see some similarities there in terms of how to grow a game that was considered, it wasn't mainstream in Australia. It had a very niche following, but in the early 90s and even into the mid 90s, that I think riding on the wave that basketball had, it was starting to gain momentum. You had, you mentioned there the Melbourne Monarchs. You had some great rivalries between Perth and Brisbane, Perth and Sydney, and that was just helping grow the game. Do you see some similarities there between the game of baseball growing and even the challenges as well faced in terms of growing the game here of footy?
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges, Ben, and that's what sort of I feel fairly uniquely placed to kind of be able to look both ways. And you're right, the baseball we did jump on the back of basketball there, and it was a ton of fun at Parry Field down there. I wasn't hitting many home runs, mate. I was the one running fast, as fast as I could. But I think when I look at how football, Aussie rules could grow in the United States, baseball was a third tier sport. If I'm really honest, that footy here is probably a fourth or fifth tier sport. I mean, it doesn't have, I've got good friends involved with rugby here in Denver through my role as Honorary Consul for Australia. I have to put on my New South Wales, Queensland cap every now and then and pretend I know about rugby. So I go along to the rugby games and the Major League Rugby here. They're ahead of the curve in many ways because of the advantage that it is way more of an international game, and that, rugby clubs can have English, South Africans, French, Kiwis, Aussies. They can have a whole mix of folks, and they've been able to kind of transfer that, if you will, that private school mentality of rugby union into the college situation here. And I think, I've talked with guys who have been here longer than me, have been pushing footy, the Rich Mans and the Paul O'Keefes and the Dennis Ryans and all of these great ambassadors for our sport. We've had various ways. Do we go bottom up? Do we try to create this Auskick movement, and Dennis would run around and do some great work and set fires in little places, and then the fire would go out because the elementary school wasn't able to do anything with it. And so, or do we go at the college level, and then do we try to come back down? And so there's always been, where do you start and build the base to go up? And I don't really know if we've sort of cracked that code as yet. I think the challenge that we found at Denver, as the kid, is the challenge that we found in Denver, I'm sure every other club finds it, is that the college kids are not around when we're playing. They're on summer break. So you can get out there and get into them in February or March, April, and then they go away. And the fact that the AFL stopped doing their combines, I think that's a big hit for us here in the States, because that was a massive carrot that you could get some kids, some athletes, some college athletes to go and try. And if they didn't quite get a chance, they'd come back to the USAFL. The other option, if you look into the crystal ball, perhaps there is some way. And with Australian Baseball, Ben, we had the Australian Baseball League, and it was regarded somewhat as a professional league that had 5 or 6 teams. It was very expensive to run, as the rugby league here, the rugby is finding here. If we were able to do something like that you could get some kind of interest in following and sponsorship, you might be able to create a little bit of a sticking place. The thing that helped us in baseball, as you said, Ben, is we're getting some pretty good Americans coming over, whether they were professional or high-level college guys that were just coming out, and they had a little bit of a profile and they were marketable. I think that might be the way that if football in 10, 15 years here takes hold, it's because we've got some, you look at soccer, like that David Beckham come over and play, and he changes the game here. Maybe we got to get Favola over here, right? He's played everywhere.
Yeah, and go ahead, Ben.
I was just going to say, that's a great point, James. You look at sports like that, baseball, how they got a lot of Americans there. The NBL did the same thing. You know, to get that game going like it did in the 90s, you know, you had some phenomenal players come over and play even from college level. You know, I mean, you look at the Wildcats and what they were able to create, and, you know, what they're still doing, you know, and how that then influenced a generation. That really did influence a young generation. I remember going to school and you grew up getting exposed to baseball. All of a sudden you had kids in the park playing baseball as opposed to playing cricket, or, you know, it gave that influence and kids were getting exposed to it. So that's a great point. And the soccer, you know, I think it resonates in soccer as well, where you saw it there, where, you know, with the NSL and with what we were able to do in Australia, where you had, you know, foreign players come over. Gradually, you started to develop your local talent, but you had foreign players come over to build that game. So, great point.
Yeah, definitely. And one of our first podcasts was actually with Chris Adams over in DC. Yeah, and he's done some amazing stuff with his Saturday morning footy program, which is basically just a little Auskick thing for you know, kids in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area, and that's been a really innovative way to grow the game. And when it comes to college kids, like you were saying, Wads, it's definitely tricky because, like, firstly, you know, again, the season is mostly in the summer, you know, the northern summer, so most of the students are gone. Also, you've got people who, you know, don't want to get injured, or people who don't really have the time to pick up a new sport from scratch, and also just the transient nature of it. You know, like, they're going to be out of there in 3-4 years. They might stick around, they might not. You know, like, obviously here in LA, we've got USC, UCLA, a dozen other schools in the greater area, but we haven't really tapped into that market just yet, primarily just because, you know, where we train might not be conducive to college kids, or, you know, we don't really know, we can't really gauge the level of interest. So it's definitely challenging with uni students, but it's an exciting challenge. And I think there's definitely a case to be made for either, you know, working with college kids exclusively or doing an Auskick type of program. Whatever can sort of foster a culture where people can come in and put their hand up and say, hey, I have no idea about this sport, but it seems great and I'll give it a crack.
Yeah, no, you're right.
Yeah, I was just gonna touch base on that. Like, your kiddo is amazing at sport there, Wads. I mean, he is awesome, and I just wanted to kind of get your take on how to grow the youth in the United States, because I know you've kind of tried to help your kid get over into Australia and have him play there, and I know you were kind of working on developing the youth side of things. So I was just kind of seeing how you see you could implement to help assist the growth of footy at a youth level, especially with younger kids. I mean, not even at the university level, but even younger than that.
Yeah. Don't say that too loud, Tara. He's just walked in and he'll get a big head. He does. He goes all right on the footy field. He loves footy. I think one of my most treasured moments was 2 years ago when I take him home each winter, and we basically follow the Eagles for 3 weeks. We'll go and watch them for 3 weekends wherever they are, and he's a lucky kid. He's been able to meet all the players. He ran out on the field with the team before a game at Optus in 2018. Pulled some Consul strings and got him to run out, and he's infatuated with the game, and we're trying to get him to get his mates infatuated in, and that's a really heavy lift. But what we tried to do, when we didn't really get it off the ground, but with the US Revs and the Freedom playing in the International Cup, Tommy Ellis and I thought, wouldn't it be cool if we had a group of kids that would go and play, you know, little league halftime games at every halftime of all of the Revs and Freedom games. And so Cooper and I put our heads together. It was really just another excuse for me to be able to take Cooper home and play footy for 2 weeks. I take him to footy. He's done footy camps. He's played local games at Aberfeldy in Melbourne and Kingsway and Perth and Port Adelaide. We just put him wherever we can. But I know that there's other people like me here, like Matty Danowski. Texas has got kids. You know, I know Ellen McGlashan up in Chicago's got a boy about my age, and there's a few of them around. And we thought, man, wouldn't it be the coolest thing if we could get a bunch of mums and dads I say mums and dads because my wife doesn't want it just to be a big old boys footy trip. But if we could do that, and so we talked about doing it, and we had a handful of folks that were interested. It was a bit difficult because the AFL were really late in deciding on the dates and the location of what was to be the International Cup this year, which is now pushed back. So we might have a chance of doing it. But I think it'd be a really fun way to get some kids interested, because right now, I think of my kid. Maybe there's two other kids around his age in Denver that will be interested in going and playing. I drag him down to training on Saturdays, and our women's team's terrific. They'll let him train with them because he's big enough to sort of train with them. It just is difficult to try to figure out how I can get a kid like him or another kid like him to stay interested in footy, and this could be something that people would be interested in. Now that we've got it, we might try it. We're going to try it again next year. Now that we've got some time up our sleeve.
Yeah, and again, talking about like what Chris Adams was doing in DC, he was actually in a very similar spot. His son, they actually both umpired at the IC in 2017. But yeah,
wow.
his son is going to school in Minnesota, I believe, and got to play with the Freeze for a little bit when he was up there, I think, and he also got a chance to just study abroad in Sydney. And when he was in Sydney, he got a
Yeah.
chance to play in the Sydney AFL competition. So I think there's a lot of opportunities for kids who might be dual citizens or who have otherwise grown up learning about footy and have always wanted to give it a crack, but they may or may not have that chance in the US until they're 18. So I think there's a lot of options on the table in terms of people who have the advantages to be able to send their kid over to Oz for a little bit, and I think that's a fantastic way to just develop their skills.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's great. I love playing with Cooper. I think he's awesome on the field. He's like so talented and amazing and super speedy. So he gives us a run for our money and always keeps us on our toes, at least with the women's team here in Denver. So I love that. Do you think that the clubs here in the US could help develop a kids game more so? I haven't seen that happen yet or seen it really develop. I know a couple clubs have tried to develop and implement a youth level league. Do you think that could happen across the United States, and how do you see that working?
Yeah, that's a real tough one, and I think about my son who's 10, right? And then there's this gap, like, everyone's like, oh well, he'll be playing in the men's. I'm like, mate, he's not playing with you idiots until he's about 18, because you're going to, there's a lot of big guys running around in the AFL, US AFL. So there's this gap, and I think it's not dissimilar to what women's footy, girls footy was finding back in Australia 10, 15 years ago, when the girls would play 10, 11, 12, and then they sort of had that weird spot where the girls were kind of not able to play with the boys, and then they have to wait 3, 4, 5, 6 years before they could play in a women's competition. And we're seeing the exact same thing here with the kids. And so it comes back to that, where do you invest your energy? At the grassroots and push up, college push down. There's that weird gap in between where there's enough kids that are interested in the younger age, and then it's that middle gap there. How do you fill it in? Some opportunities that you can do, and I think it's just like the men. We don't get to play every weekend, and the women here, we don't get to play every weekend against another team. So the more and more I think we can add in during our tournament games, if we can really market a kids game, and I've put kids games on at every Central Western regionals we've held here. I do it at nationals. I'm the guy that puts on the game at nationals for kids. There's usually one or two other crazy dads like me that want to see their kids play. We can maybe get a little bit more backing from the USAFL to kind of really formalize those. I said to Tommy Ellis, when the USA play Canada, let's really work with the Canadian League to try to get them to get a little kids team playing as well. And it's going to be small, maybe you have 10 or 12 aside at the age of 10, 11, 12, and you just play a game against each other. It gives the kids something to look forward to. Now, my kid is going to continue to play all of his other sports, but any chance he gets to play footy, he'll do it. And if we can get enough families around the country that know that there's always going to be something for their kid to shoot for in the middle of the year, at the end of the year, 2 or 3 times a year, not dissimilar to what all the USAFL players have to look forward to.
Yeah, and I think it's almost like the perfect storm for a lot of parents because footy's played in the summer over here, and kids need summertime activities, and a lot of times, you're at home pulling your hair out because the kids have too much energy. So you might as well have them go down to the park and have a kick. So there you go.
Yeah, yeah, and I think the key can be too is if each kid just gets another kid, right there. It's the same kind of recruiting approach we do with all of our USAFL clubs. Just go and find someone, one person.
Yep, exactly.
But yeah. So turning the page a little bit, Wad. So you've mentioned the consulate a few times already. For our viewers, a lot of people don't know, either in the US or in Australia, that one of the official USAFL patrons is Joe Hockey, who's the Australian ambassador to the US. Did you happen to have any role in getting him on board, or is that something you can't quite take credit for?
Right, gotcha. So actually, Joe's no longer the ambassador. He termed out in January. Arthur Sinodinos is
Mm.
the new ambassador. So Mr. Sinodinos walked in at a very interesting time. Joe was a very interesting character. I got to meet Joe. I was appointed as honorary consul to Denver 2 years ago, about 2.5 years ago. And we have two honorary consuls, the Australian government in the United States, myself and a gentleman in Miami. And we have 7 full consul offices around the country, Honolulu, LA, San Fran, Chicago, New York, DC, and Houston. As an honorary consul, my primary role really is to be the first port of call for any Australian citizen in the region who needs consular assistance in the space. Typically, if they're in maybe some kind of crash, incident, something occurs, they're in hospital, maybe jail, or worse. So those are kind of the primary role that I fill. Generally, I'm sort of handballing it over to the full-time professionals in LA, which is where I operate under, if things get super serious. But generally, I'm sort of more like a traffic cop than a real cop. I have another part of that role is the public diplomacy and the business diplomacy and the football, the exchange and the mateship branding that Joe Hockey, really pushed on. Is part of what I do. It's sort of trying to continue to create those social and business ties between the two countries, and that's the part I really enjoy. I do business breakfasts here, do Anzac Day business breakfast, do Melbourne Cup business breakfast. We put on Australia Day. We part of always supported the Bulldogs in their grand final night, just like I'm sure happens in all of the cities where we have footy clubs and Australian expats. So that's an honorary role on the side. I actually have a day job. People don't know that, but I have a day job. But yeah.
No, that's really cool.
Yeah,
That's
you do
really
so
cool.
much, Waz. We never know what you're doing. It's all over the place with everything. You got your hand in so much stuff. How did you get into being an
Yeah.
honorary consul? Like, why did you decide to do that? What made you want to take that on?
Well, I kind of Stephen Bradbury my way into that, to be quite honest. I and there's hopefully the Stephen Bradbury reference. Well, so what happened? We actually had a honorary consul here for many, many years. His name is Mark O'Regan, and Sir Mark O'Regan, and he had retired about 4 years ago. And I actually didn't think they were going to replace his role. I didn't really understand what he did. But when he retired, a lot of the people in the community were asking me what was going on, because I'd sort of taken over running Oz Denver at that stage. And I contacted the LA Consul and I asked them. They said, we've got a few folks who've nominated themselves and we're vetting them right now. I said, okay, well, when you pick somebody, let me know. I'll either know them, or if I don't, I'll plug them into the community. Terrific. And this went on for months and months. And eventually I asked again, and they said, well, the people we're vetting we've got some conflict of interest issues. And I thought that was interesting. And I basically just said to them, well, if you're having trouble finding someone, I'd be honored to be considered. And that was my interview. And then I got recommended the next time. And then I went through all of the background checks and had to think about what I did when I was 16 in Perth, and hopefully none of that came up, and I was all good. I got cleared by DFAT, and then I got cleared by the US State Department. So I have a fancy State Department ID, and I have license plates with Oz01, and I can park anywhere. There's some interesting perks.
Yeah, definitely.
Definitely.
That's a unique role for sure.
Yeah, I do. I mean, it was quite busy in the last few weeks with all of this coronavirus. I was fielding many calls from Australians who were pretty nervous and anxious and distressed about the situation, whether they could get home. So there's definitely some serious moments. And I've done a few jail visits with Australians who find themselves in jail here, and that's always an interesting moment when you go and visit with them. So yeah, there's some fun stuff and some serious stuff.
Sounds like it.
Just a question for you there, James. You mentioned there, just around the Australian community overall here, and we see that with a lot of the social media groups, and there is a lot of uncertainty and nerves obviously with COVID-19 currently going on. Are you seeing as well kind of a silver lining in terms of the unity that's being created through that? I know Rick and Tara are seeing this, that footy is actually proving to unite everyone and give something. We're able to give back to it, but we're also able to use it to really bring everyone together. What are you seeing in terms of the community spirit and that Aussie spirit of supporting each other when times are tough? How are you seeing that at the moment?
Yeah, Ben, you're right. I think everybody, whether you're an Aussie or an American or any nationality here in the country right now, you're feeling the need for your community. And I think, we've probably all got stories of people who had trips planned home, and I have a trip planned in June, and I think that's going to be happening this year. So you sort of your need for your people, if you will, and for us Australians that live here, our footy clubs are very much our people, and whether you're an American on our club or an Aussie or a Kiwi or whatever you are on our club, you're part of our clubs. And I think from what I'm seeing, guys like yourselves, and it's really giving people a chance to really sort of refine their social media efforts and their efforts to really reach out to people who are being probably forced to be a little bit more proactive in our outreach because we're not getting the chance to see each other face to face. So I hope that is a positive that can come out of this, that we've really are making more of an effort to connect with each other.
Very true.
Fantastic.
That's extremely important.
Yeah, it's an unprecedented time, but I think once we're all finally together again, like whether it's at regionals or nationals or wherever, it's gonna be special. I think they're gonna develop a newfound appreciation of the game that maybe even they didn't know they had. It's one of those, oh, don't know what you have till it's gone type of things. So I think, once we're able to resume normal operations, obviously we're still waiting on the USAFL's decision on the 1st of May. But yeah, it's going to be fun once we're finally able to get back out there, and I couldn't be more stoked to start training again, start having a run, having a kick. It's going to be really fun once we're actually able to do it.
Kicking to a person,
Yeah.
Rick, instead of a tree. It's always a good thing.
Exactly.
I can't take any speckies off the trees either because the neighbors complain. So
Exactly.
That's great. Well, yeah, I think we're all looking forward to having our season start. And I know I'm looking forward to working with Wads with the Denver Bulldogs and everyone else getting back out there with their teams. So it's going to be interesting to see what happens next and where we're going to go and when we're going to start again. But I think it'll be a good season for everybody at the end.
definitely.
Definitely.
All right. Well, that's about it for me. You guys have any more questions?
I do not.
Nothing from me, Rick. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Wads. Really appreciate you stopping by. Hopefully we can reconnect with you later in the season, fingers crossed. And yeah, wish you all the best and good luck.
Yeah, thank you, Wads, for being on here.
Thanks, Wads.
Thanks, Tara. Thanks, Rick. And thanks, Ben. Look forward to seeing you all guys at some point during the season. All the best.
Cheers,
Likewise.
mate. Appreciate
Cheers.
it.
Outside 50 is brought to you with the help of Play Aussie USA. Play Aussie is the only place in the USA you can buy the famous Sharon football, a proud sponsor of the USAFL. Visit them at playaussie.com.